The dust didn't care who you were. It settled on the righteous and the damned all the same. A fine red powder that got into a man's soul and stayed there. For Boone Carter, it felt like the grit of his own life grinding down to nothing. It coated the splintered wood of his wagon, the cracked leather of the reins in his hands, and the tired coat of his old mare, Bess. Everything he owned in the world was covered in it. He had once been a man of the soil, a farmer with 100 acres of dark, rich earth that promised a future. He'd had a wife, Martha, whose laughter was the only music he ever needed, and whose hands could coax life from the most stubborn seed. The land had taken her first, a fever that burned through her in 3 short days, leaving him with a silence so profound it felt like the world had lost its sound. Then the drought came, a slow, merciless thief that baked his fields to brick and turned his crops to tinder. The bank, with its polite letters and ironclad laws, took the rest. So here he was, a man of 40 years who felt 100, with nothing but a tired horse, a rickety wagon containing a few tools and a threadbare blanket, and a single, folded piece of paper in his breast pocket. That paper was the last ember of hope in a life gone to ash. It was a deed, signed and stamped, for a small house and 5 acres of land tucked away in a valley he'd never seen. The price had been $40, 40 silver dollars, counted out from the last of his savings into the soft, well-manicured hand of a man named Quentin Slade in a town 2 weeks back. Slade had been smooth, his words like honey. A man like you, Mr. Carter, a man of fortitude, deserves a place to rest his head, a place to start anew. This property, it's a bit remote, I'll grant you, but the stream runs year-round and the soil is good. The previous owner, Elias Ward, had to leave on account of family matters back east. His loss is your gain. $40. It felt too cheap, a price that whispered of problems unseen. But a drowning man doesn't question the log he's thrown. He just hangs on. Boone had hung on. For 2 weeks. He and Bess had crawled across the scorched plains. The idea of that small house pulling them forward, a roof, a door that locked, a piece of ground he could call his own. It was a humble dream, but it was all he had left. The valley, when he finally found it, was just as Slade had described. It wasn't grand, just a crease in the earth flanked by low, rocky mesas. A thin ribbon of green marked the path of a creek, lined with cottonwoods that shimmered in the afternoon heat, and there, nestled in a crook of the valley wall, was the house. It wasn't much more than a box, built of rough-hewn timber that had weathered to a soft gray. A stone chimney stood at one end. Crooked but solid, it was small, lonely, and stubborn. And for the first time in a year, Boone felt a crack in the hardness around his heart. He could make this work. He could dig a garden, fix the roof, maybe even get a few chickens come spring. He could build a life here, a quiet one, a life where the ghosts of his past didn't crowd him so closely. He urged Bess forward, the wagon wheels groaning a final complaint as they rolled onto the dusty patch of ground that served as a yard. He was about to swing himself down when he saw it. A thin, almost invisible wisp of smoke curling from the stone chimney. He froze, his hand on the wagon seat. His first thought was of drifters, men like himself, only without the $40 deed in their pocket. A flicker of anger, hot and protective, shot through him. He'd paid for this. He'd bled for the money that paid for this. He wouldn't be driven off by squatters. He climbed down slowly, his movement stiff from the long ride. His boots made no sound in the thick dust. As he got closer, he saw other signs. A bucket sitting by a well-worn path to the creek. A small patch of herbs growing near the front door, carefully tended. And on a rope strung between the house and a cottonwood sapling, a single piece of clean, mended linen fluttered in the breeze. This wasn't the work of a passing drifter. Someone was living here. Someone was making a home here. He walked to the door, a solid-looking thing of heavy planks, and knocked. His knuckles made a hollow, definitive sound. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, he heard a faint shuffle from within. The latch scraped, and the door opened a few inches. A woman's face appeared in the gap. She wasn't white. Her skin was the color of rich copper, her hair a cascade of black silk pulled back from a high-boned face. Her eyes, dark and intelligent, sized him up in an instant. They held no welcome, only a deep, weary caution. She was Apache. He knew, though he couldn't have said how. There was a stillness about her, a rootedness that spoke of a connection to this land that went deeper than any piece of paper. "Can I help you?" Her voice was low and steady, her English clear but accented. Boone felt a knot tighten in his stomach. This was more complicated than he'd thought. He cleared his throat, trying to keep his own voice even. "Ma'am, my name is Boone Carter. I've come to take possession of this house." The woman's expression didn't change, but something hardened in her eyes. "You're mistaken. This house is spoken for." "I don't think so," Boone said, reaching into his pocket. He carefully unfolded the deed, the paper crinkling with the sound of his last hope. "I have the deed of sale. Bought it, legal and proper. From Mr. Quentin Slade. $40. He held it out for her to see. She glanced at the paper but made no move to take it. Her focus remained on his face. "We have an agreement." "An agreement with who?" The door opened wider, and another figure appeared behind the first woman. This one was younger, a girl on the cusp of womanhood. Her face was softer, her eyes wider and filled with a more immediate fear. She clutched a fold of the older woman's dress. "It doesn't matter," the older woman said, her voice dropping to a protective growl. "We pay our due. This is our home now." Boone's patience, worn thin by grief and travel, began to fray. "Ma'am, I don't want any trouble, but this is my property. I have the law on my side." "The law," she repeated, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. "Your law has never been on our side. We were given this place. We were promised safety here." A cold dread began to seep into Boone's bones, colder than any winter night he'd ever known. He was beginning to see the shape of the trap he'd walked into. Promised by who? "His name is not your concern," the woman said flatly. "Was his name Quentin Slade?" Boone asked, his voice quiet. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed the woman's face. The younger girl behind her let out a small, sharp gasp. "How do you know that name?" the woman demanded. "He's the man who sold me this house," Boone said, the words feeling heavy and stupid in his own mouth. The three of them stood there in a tableau of disbelief. The weary white man who'd lost everything, and the two Apache sisters who had nothing to lose. All of them caught in the web of a man named Slade. "We have been here 6 months, the older sister said, her voice regaining its strength. "My name is Tessa. This is my sister, Daisy. We came here after our people were moved from the reservation. There was nothing for us. Mr. Slade said we could have this house. He said it was abandoned. He promised to protect us, to see that no one bothered us, if we paid him $5 a month." Boone's heart sank. $5 a month for 6 months, $30, and his 40. Slade had made $70 on a house he likely had no right to sell in the first place. "He gave us papers," Daisy whispered, her voice trembling. She looked at her sister. "Show him, Tessa." Tessa hesitated, then nodded curtly. She disappeared into the dim interior of the cabin, returning a moment later with a small, folded piece of foolscap. It wasn't a deed. It was a handwritten receipt, crude and simple, noting the payment of $5 for lodging and protection. It was signed with Slade's flourishing, arrogant signature, the same one that was on Boone's deed. "This isn't a legal document," Boone said, though the words felt hollow. "It's just a receipt." "It is a promise," Tessa insisted, her eyes flashing. "It is his word. We have paid. We have stayed. We have harmed no one. We have nowhere else to go." Boone looked from her fierce, defiant face to Daisy's terrified one. He looked at the small, tended herb garden, at the clean linen drying in the sun. They hadn't just been staying here, they had been building a life, just as he had dreamed of doing. They had been clinging to their own log in the same river that was drowning him. He could insist. He could ride to the nearest town, find a marshal, and have them removed. The law, his law, would be on his side. His deed would trump their flimsy receipt. But what then? Where would they go back to the reservation that had failed them? Out into the wilderness where two women alone were prey for any man with cruelty in his heart. He looked at the house, his house, the symbol of his last chance. And he looked at the two women standing in the doorway, defending it as their last chance. A bitter, ironic laugh threatened to escape his throat. Quentin Slade had not just sold him a house, he had sold him an impossible choice. The sun was beginning to dip below the mesas, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. A cool evening breeze stirred the dust at his feet. He was tired. A deep, bone-crushing weariness settled over him. He had no energy for a fight, not a real one. "I'm not leaving," he said, his voice flat. It wasn't a threat, just a statement of fact. He had nowhere to go. This valley was the end of the line for him. Tessa lifted her chin. "Neither are we." The impasse was absolute. A $40 house, not big enough for one man's grief, now had to contain the hopes and fears of three people, without another word. Boone turned and walked back to his wagon. He unhitched Bess, leading her to the creek for a long drink. He pulled his blanket from the wagon bed, along with a small sack of oats for the horse and a piece of hardtack for himself. He didn't go far. He made a small, cold camp under the branches of the nearest cottonwood, just beyond the circle of light that would fall from the cabin's window when they lit a lamp. It was a silent declaration. He would not force them out tonight, but he would not disappear. He was here to stay. Inside the cabin, he saw the flicker of a lantern being lit. A shadow moved across the window. He knew they were watching him. Two women with a worthless promise, watching a man with a worthless deed. The house stood between them, a silent, wooden fortress, and Boone Carter, the farmer who had lost everything, began to suspect that his $40 had bought him more trouble than he could possibly have imagined. He gnawed on his hardtack, the dry biscuit turning to paste in his mouth, and settled in for a long, sleepless night. The sun rose without ceremony, a merciless white eye in a pale sky. Boone Carter woke to the cold seeping up from the ground, his blanket a poor defense against the night's chill. Every bone in his body ached with a familiar weariness. He sat up, pushing the hair from his eyes, and looked toward the cabin. There was no smoke from the chimney. The door was shut fast. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath. He knew they were in there. The two Apache women, watching, waiting. He was a threat, a man with a piece of paper that said their world was a lie. And they, in turn, were the living, breathing obstacle to his last chance at a life. The $40 he'd paid felt like a fool's wager on a game that was already rigged. For hours, the standoff held. Boone fed Bess the last of her oats and led her to the creek, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't approach the house. He stayed by his wagon, cleaning a rusty skillet, sharpening his axe, performing the small, mundane tasks of a man with nowhere to go. He was a stone in their path, and he had no intention of being moved. Around mid-morning, the cabin door opened. It was the older one, Tessa. She moved with a straight-backed grace that seemed to defy the hardship etched on her face. In her hand, she carried a wooden bucket. She didn't look at Boone, but he felt her awareness of him as a tangible thing, like the heat from a fire. She walked the worn path to the creek, her focus fixed ahead. Boone didn't move. He simply watched. He saw the strength in her shoulders, the efficient way she dipped the bucket into the running water. This was not a woman given to hysterics or pleading. She was a survivor, and he understood, in a way he couldn't quite articulate, that her claim to this place was written in the 6 months of work and worry she had invested in it, a currency more real than his silver dollars. As she started back, her path brought her closer to his camp. He knew this was his moment. He could be silent, and let the hostility fester. Or he could speak. He chose the latter, his voice rough from disuse. "That deed," he said, not standing, not making any move that could be seen as a threat. "The one Slade gave you. It's not a deed." Tessa stopped. She set the heavy bucket down, her knuckles white. "It is his promise." "A promise from a man like that isn't worth the paper it's written on," Boone replied. His tone flat. "I learned that 2 weeks ago. Looks like you've been learning it for 6 months." She looked at him then, her dark eyes searching his face for deceit. "He promised us protection." The word hung in the air between them. Protection. Boone thought of his own farm, how the sky had offered no protection from the sun, how the law had offered no protection from the bank. It was a word for children's stories. Protection from what he asked. "From a world that has no place for us," she said, her voice low and fierce. "Our people were moved south. The soldiers came, with their blue coats and their empty eyes, and told us the land was no longer ours. They put us on a reservation where the soil is sand and the water is poison. The sickness came. The agent in charge sold our food for whiskey and gave us blankets thin enough to read the Bible through." She spoke without emotion, listing the facts as a clerk might list inventory. It was this lack of sentiment that made her story so devastating. It was a truth she had lived so long it no longer needed to be decorated with tears. "My husband," she continued, her gaze drifting toward the horizon. He tried to argue with the agent. They called him a troublemaker. 2 soldiers took him away for questioning. He never came back. So I took my sister, Daisy, and we walked away in the night. We walked until our feet bled. We had nothing. We were nothing. Daisy had appeared in the doorway of the cabin, a silent ghost listening to her sister recount their history. Her young face was a canvas of fear and sorrow. "That's when we met Mr. Slade," Tessa said, her eyes returning to Boone. "He was in a town, dressed in a fine suit, smelling of cigars and sweet words. He saw us. He saw 2 stray dogs, I suppose. He told us he knew of a place, an abandoned cabin, a place where we could be safe, where no one would look for us. All he asked was $5 a month. For his trouble, for his protection." Boone's gut twisted. He saw the whole sordid picture now. Slade hadn't just found 2 desperate women. He had curated their desperation. He had put them here, in this remote valley, like pieces on a chessboard. Knowing they were trapped, they couldn't go to the law, for the law would only send them back to the reservation. They couldn't leave, for they had nowhere to go. They were his captives, paying for the privilege of living in a cage they thought was a sanctuary. They weren't renting a house. They were victims of a cruel and drawn-out extortion. "He's been taking your money for 6 months, Boone said, the words feeling like stones in his mouth. "And then he sold the property to me. He took my $40 and left us both here to fight over the scraps." The raw injustice of it was staggering. Boone's own loss felt small and selfish in the face of theirs. He had lost a farm, a wife, a future. They had lost a nation. All that was left to them was this tiny cabin, this 5-acre patch of dirt, and even that was built on a foundation of lies. His deed, the legal and proper document folded in his pocket, suddenly felt like a weapon. He could use it. He could ride to the nearest marshal, present his paper, and the law would stand behind him. They would come and evict these 2 women, casting them back into the wilderness. He would have his house. He would have his 5 acres. And he would have to live with the knowledge that he had completed the circle of their destruction. He would become just another white man with a piece of paper, using it to erase people who had been there first. He looked at his hands, calloused and cracked from years of honest labor. He had never been a cruel man. A hard man, yes, a broken man, certainly, but never cruel. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that he couldn't do it. He couldn't be the instrument of their final ruin. Tessa watched him, her expression unreadable. She was waiting for his verdict. "You have no family?" he asked, his voice softer now. She shook her head. "Only Daisy." The silence stretched again, but it had changed. The sharp edge of hostility had been replaced by the dull, heavy weight of a shared reality. They were three people swindled by the same man, stranded in the same forgotten valley. Boone stood up slowly. He walked over to his wagon and pulled out a shovel, its wooden handle smooth from use. He didn't walk toward the house. Instead, he walked to the small, overgrown patch of land that might one day be a garden. The soil was dry and packed hard. A few stubborn weeds clung to life. He put his boot to the back of the shovel blade and pressed down. The metal scraped against the dry earth, a jarring, grating sound that broke the valley's silence. He lifted the first shovelful of dirt and tossed it aside. Then he did it again and again. From the cabin, the two sisters watched. They saw him work, his back bent, his movements rhythmic and steady. He wasn't leaving, but he wasn't advancing on them either. He was doing something else entirely. He was digging in. He was turning the soil, an act of faith in a future that didn't yet exist. For the first time in a long, long while. Boone Carter wasn't running from his past or surrendering to his fate. He was choosing to stand his ground, right on the blurry, uncertain line between what the law said was his and what his conscience said was right. He had a worthless deed, and they had a worthless promise. It wasn't much, but here, in the quiet of the valley, with the sun beating down on his back, he decided it would have to be enough to start with. He kept digging, for 3 days. A fragile truce held the valley. It was a silence measured in the scrape of Boone's shovel against the hard-packed earth and the quiet clicks of Tessa's sewing needle from the cabin's open doorway. Boone worked from sunup to sundown, clearing a patch of land for a garden he had no seeds for. It was the only thing he knew how to do. This act of imposing order on a chaotic world. He was speaking a language of labor, and he hoped they understood. Tessa and Daisy watched him. They left a bucket of fresh water near his wagon each morning and a small bundle of dried herbs good for tea each evening. They were gestures as quiet and cautious as his own. They were three people circling a shared problem, none of them knowing the steps to the dance. The house stood between them, a prize no one was sure they could claim, while the real owner of their predicament, Quentin Slade, remained a ghost. The peace broke on the 4th day. They came on horseback. 3 riders emerging from the heat shimmer of the plains like a mirage given malevolent form. They didn't ride like farmers or prospectors. They rode with a lazy, arrogant slump that spoke of men who took what they wanted and were rarely told no. The man in the lead was broad and thick-necked, with a face that looked like it had lost a fight with a barbed wire fence. A puckered, angry scar ran from the corner of his left eye down to his jaw, pulling his lip into a permanent sneer. He was the kind of man whose ugliness started on the inside. The 2 men flanking him were cut from the same rough cloth, their faces blank and brutish, their eyes scanning the small homestead with a predator's idle curiosity. Boone stopped his digging, resting one hand on the handle of his shovel. He felt a cold knot form in his stomach. These men were not here to admire the scenery. They ignored him completely, as if he were no more than a stump or a rock. Their horses ambled directly toward the cabin, stopping a few feet from the door. Tessa had already appeared in the doorway, a broom in her hand that looked as much a weapon as a tool. Daisy peered out from behind her face pale. The man with the scar leaned forward, resting his forearms on his saddle horn. He didn't dismount. It was a calculated display of dominance. "Afternoon, ladies," he drawled, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Come to collect." Tessa's grip tightened on the broom handle. "We have nothing for you, Jed." "Now, Tessa, that ain't the agreement. The man," Jed said with a humorless smile, "the agreement is $5 a month. You're 3 months behind. That comes to $15. Mr. Slade is a businessman. He expects his accounts to be settled." $15? The number was a death sentence. Boone knew they didn't have it. He doubted they had 15 cents between them. He had a few dollars left himself, tucked into a leather pouch. but not enough. This was the protection Tessa had spoken of, not a shield, but a shackle. These men were Slade's walking, talking interest payment. It was time to stop being a rock. Boone started walking toward them, his shovel still in his hand. He didn't hold it like a weapon, just let it hang loosely at his side. "There seems to be a misunderstanding," Boone said, his voice steady. The three riders turned their heads to look at him, their expressions ranging from mild curiosity to outright contempt. It was the first time they had acknowledged his existence. "Who in the hell are you?" Jed asked, his sneer deepening. "My name is Boone Carter, and I own this property," Boone said. He reached into his coat, pulled out his folded deed and held it up. "Bought and paid for. You and your business have no place here." Jed looked at the paper, then at Boone's face, and then he let out a short, barking laugh. The other two men, Cole and Silas, chuckled along with him. "Paper," Jed scoffed, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust near Boone's feet. "Out here, old man. The only paper that matters is the kind you can use to start a fire. Now, step aside. We're conducting business with the ladies." Boone didn't move. He saw the cold reality laid bare. His deed, his legal claim, his connection to the world of laws and order, meant nothing here. Here, the only law was the one these three men carried in the holsters on their hips. He saw Daisy shrink further behind her sister. He saw the defiant terror in Tessa's eyes. She was trying to be strong, but she was a lone woman against three armed thugs. The fragile world they had tried to build was about to be torn apart. Something inside Boone, something long dormant and buried under layers of grief and resignation, shifted. He had let the bank take his farm. He had let the fever take his wife. He had let the world beat him down until he had nothing left to lose. But standing here, in this dusty yard, he found that wasn't entirely true. He could still lose his self-respect. "How much did you say?" Boone asked, his voice calm. $15. Jed's eyes narrowed. "What's it to you?" "They don't have it," Boone said, ignoring the sharp, angry look Tessa shot him. "But I might. I'll pay their debt. Just this once. Then you leave, and you don't come back. Your business here is concluded." He was trying to buy them peace. It was a desperate move, offering money he barely had to solve a problem that wasn't his. Jed exchanged a look with his men. Another cold smile spread across his scarred face. It was the smile of a wolf who had just been offered a piece of bread when it had its eye on the entire lamb. "Well now," Jed said slowly, savoring the moment. "That's mighty generous of you, stranger. But you see, there's a problem with your offer. This ain't just about the $15. That's just the back pay. There are other accounts to consider. The agreement with Mr. Slade is a long-term one." He let his gaze drift from Boone and settled deliberately on Tessa, then on the younger, trembling Daisy. He looked them over not as people, but as property, his eyes lingering in a way that made the air grow thick and foul. "Mr. Slade is a reasonable man," Jed continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was more menacing than any shout. "He understands that coin can be hard to come by. He's always willing to entertain alternative forms of payment." The implication was as clear and as ugly as the scar on his face. It hung in the hot, still air, a poison that sickened the soul. This was never about $5 a month. That was just the hook. The real price was something else entirely. It was about ownership. It was about taking not just their money, but their dignity, their safety, their very selves. Boone felt a surge of cold fury. He was no gunslinger, no brawler. He was a farmer. His hands were made for coaxing life from the earth, not for violence. But in that moment, he wanted nothing more than to wipe the smirk off Jed's face with the flat of his shovel. Tessa took a half-step forward, placing herself more fully in front of her sister. Her face was a mask of cold hatred. "You will leave this place," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "Now." "We'll leave," Jed said, nodding slowly. "For now, but we'll be back. In 3 days. Mr. Slade will expect an answer, either the money or a commitment to the new arrangement. He looked pointedly at Daisy. He's particularly interested in starting a new account with the little one. Says she looks like she'd be grateful for the protection. That last comment was the final twist of the knife. With a final, contemptuous glance at Boone, Jed pulled on his reins. Turning his horse, his two companions followed suit. 3 days, Jed called over his shoulder as they rode away, their laughter echoing back, ugly and triumphant. They left behind a silence that was heavier and more terrifying than the one before. The dust settled, but the dread remained, a choking cloud that enveloped the three of them. Boone looked at Tessa and Daisy. They were no longer the Apache women who lived in his house. He was no longer the white man who wanted to evict them. The line Slade had drawn between them had been erased. Now, there was only one line that mattered, the one that separated the three of them from the predators who were coming back to collect. And this time, the price would be far more than $40. The dust from their departure settled long before the silence in the yard did. It was a heavy, suffocating thing, thick with the unsaid and the unthinkable. Jed's final, leering words about Daisy seemed to have poisoned the very air, leaving a stain that couldn't be wiped away. Daisy had fled back into the cabin, and the only sound was a faint, choked sob from within its dark confines. Tessa stood frozen, the broom held tight in her hands, her knuckles bloodless. Her pride, her fierce, protective shell, had been cracked wide open, and what lay beneath was raw, desperate fear. She was a warrior, but she had no weapons for this kind of fight. Boone felt a hollow ache in his chest, a feeling he remembered from the day he'd buried his wife. It was the feeling of powerlessness, of watching a storm gather that you had no way to stop. He looked at his shovel, then at his own empty hands. He had thought his troubles were about land and money. He now understood they were about something far older and uglier. He walked slowly to the cabin door and stopped. He didn't enter. It wasn't his place. He spoke to Tessa's rigid back. "This is all connected," he said, his voice low. "It's all him." Tessa didn't turn. "What are you talking about?" "The man who sold me this house. The man you pay for protection." It's the same man, Quentin Slade. The name, spoken aloud, was like a key turning in a lock. Tessa finally turned to face him, her eyes burning with a dark fire. In her gaze, he saw not just fear, but the dawning, sickening light of comprehension. "He told us the house was abandoned," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "He said the owner was long gone, that no one would ever come looking for it." "He told me the owner, a man named Elias Ward, had to leave suddenly," Boone countered. "Completing the circle. Family business back east. He said the deed was clear and the title was his to sell." The whole rotten scheme lay exposed between them. It was a piece of monstrously simple, brutally effective cruelty. Quentin Slade had found a piece of property with a questionable title or an absent owner to the desperate Apache sisters. He sold safety from a hostile world, bleeding them for every dollar they could find while holding the threat of exposure over their heads. To the desperate, landless farmer, he sold a new beginning, a tangible, legal deed for a piece of that same world. He was using the same small cabin and 5 acres of dusty land to profit from 2 entirely different kinds of desperation. Boone and the sisters weren't his only victims. They were his tools, meant to be turned against each other. He had likely counted on Boone, the white man with the legal paper, to simply run the women off, tidying up one end of his swindle, or, if Boone failed, he could use the conflict as leverage. No matter who won the fight over the house, Quentin Slade would profit from the struggle. He wasn't just a cheat. He was a puppeteer, and they were all dancing on his strings. "He never meant for any of us to have this place," Boone said, the realization settling like a stone in his gut. "He's just milking it for whatever he can get. When we're no use to him anymore, he'll find new people to trick." A fresh wave of sobs came from inside the cabin. The sound pierced Tessa's rage, and her shoulders slumped. The warrior vanished, replaced by a terrified older sister. "Daisy," she breathed, her composure crumbling. She looked at Boone, her eyes pleading for the first time. What he said about my sister. Men like that, they don't make idle threats. "I know," Boone said quietly. He finally stepped over the threshold into the cabin's dim interior. It was clean and sparse. A small table, 2 stools, 2 bedrolls on the floor. A few clay pots were neatly stacked near the hearth. It was a home, fought for and painstakingly assembled from nothing. And Slade's men were threatening to burn it to the ground, figuratively and perhaps literally. Daisy was huddled on one of the bedrolls, her face buried in her arms. Tessa went to her, kneeling and putting a protective arm around her shaking shoulders, murmuring to her in the soft, flowing sounds of the Apache tongue. Boone stood by the door, feeling like an intruder. This was their sanctuary, and he was a stranger. But the threat outside made strangers into allies. "We can't pay them," Tessa said, her voice muffled, not looking up from her sister. "We have nothing left. We used the last of what we had to buy flour and salt 2 weeks ago." "And paying them wouldn't solve it," Boone said grimly. "Jed made that clear. This isn't about the $15. It's about what comes next. They'll keep coming back, and their price will keep going up." "We could fight," Tessa said, a hard edge returning to her voice. "I can shoot, not as well as my husband did, but I can hit what I aim at." Boone thought of the 3 of them, Jed, Cole, and Silas. They were hard men, accustomed to violence. He had a shovel and an old axe. Tessa might have a rifle, but they would be outgunned and outnumbered. "We might chase them off once," he said, shaking his head, "but they'll be back, and they'll bring more men. Slade won't let his investment go. We can't win that way. A fight is what they expect. It's a game they're better at than we are." A sense of hopelessness began to fill the small room. They were trapped. They couldn't run, they couldn't pay, and they couldn't fight. Boone's mind churned, searching for a different path, a different weapon. They couldn't break the men Slade sent, so they had to break Slade's power over them. And what was his power built on? Lies. The lie that the house was abandoned. The lie that he had the right to sell it. The lie that he could offer protection. "There's one person in this story who isn't here," Boone said slowly, thinking aloud. "Slade built this entire trap on his absence." Tessa looked up, her face questioning. "Elias Ward," Boone said. "The man who owned this house before us? Slade's story stinks. A man doesn't just walk away from his land, not unless he's forced. What if he didn't go back east? What if he's the key to all of this?" The idea was a flicker of light in a dark room. It was thin, fragile, but it was something other than despair. "What if we can find out what really happened to him?" Boone continued, the plan forming as he spoke. "If Slade forced him out, if he cheated him, then my deed is worthless, and so is his claim on you. The whole thing collapses. We need proof. We need a truth that's stronger than Slade's guns." Tessa stroked Daisy's hair, her expression thoughtful. The fire in her eyes was no longer just anger. It was calculation. She had been surviving her whole life by being smarter and tougher than her enemies. Boone was offering a way to be smarter. How, she asked, the question sharp and practical. Where would we even begin to look for such a truth? "We start here," Boone said, his gaze sweeping the small cabin. "Ward lived here. This was his home. People leave traces. A letter, a document, something he might have left behind or hidden. Slade's men wouldn't have been looking for paperwork. They'd be looking for valuables. Maybe they missed something. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was better than waiting for Jed and his men to return for Daisy. For the first time, a decision was made not as individuals with competing claims, but as a group with a shared enemy. The imaginary lines of ownership over the cabin floorboards dissolved. Tessa looked from Boone's determined face to her sister's terrified one. She knew in her bones that Boone was right. A battle of violence was a battle they would lose, but a battle of wits, of truth. That was a fight they might have a chance to win. She gave Daisy's shoulder a final, reassuring squeeze and stood up. She walked to the hearth and picked up the poker, her movements crisp and decisive. "Then we start looking," she declared. Her voice was steady now, filled with a grim purpose. "We have 3 days." The pact was sealed. Boone Carter, the broken farmer, and Tessa and Daisy, the dispossessed sisters, were no longer fighting over a house. They were fighting for their lives. And their only hope was to uncover the secrets of the man who had lived and, perhaps, died within these 4 walls. They were going to find the ghost of Elias Ward. The search began with a grim, silent efficiency. The 3-day clock had started ticking, and every moment wasted was a victory for Quentin Slade. They moved through the small cabin not as 3 individuals, but as a single unit with a shared purpose. Tessa, with her meticulous eye, started with the walls, running her fingers along the chinking between the logs, searching for any loose spot, any hollow space where a man might hide his secrets. Daisy, her fear now channeled into a quiet focus, took down the few pots and pans, checking the small shelf they sat on, tapping the stones of the hearth. Boone took the floor. It was made of rough-hewn planks laid over the packed earth, common for a cabin of this type. It was uneven and creaked under his weight. He started at one corner, systematically testing each board. He wasn't looking for a grand trapdoor, but for something small, something subtle, a board that gave just a little too much, a nail head that looked newer than its neighbors. Elias Ward, if he was hiding something from men like Slade, would have been clever about it. For over an hour, the only sounds were the soft scrape of fingers on wood, the tap of knuckles on stone, and the groan of aging timber. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of sunlight cutting through the cabin's lone window. It was a frustrating, hopeless task. The cabin was a simple box, offering up no secrets. It was Daisy who saw it. She had been tasked with clearing the floor space, moving the 2 bedrolls aside, as she lifted the one in the far corner, the one tucked away in the deepest shadow. She noticed the floorboard beneath it was cleaner than the others, a thin outline in the dust, as if it had been lifted more recently. "Tessa," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Look." Boone and Tessa converged on the spot. Boone knelt, his calloused fingers tracing the faint outline. He pressed down. The board had a slight give to it, a subtle springiness the others lacked. He took the tip of his knife from his belt and worked it into the seam. With a prying motion, he lifted. The board came up with a soft sigh of displaced earth. Beneath it was a dark, rectangular void, and nestled inside, wrapped in what looked like oilcloth, was a small, iron-banded chest. It wasn't large, no bigger than a preacher's Bible box, but it felt heavy with significance. They had found something. Boone reached into the hole and lifted it out. It was solid, made of dark wood and bound with rusted iron straps. A heavy-looking lock, green with verdigris, secured the lid. There was no key. "He locked it," Tessa said, stating the obvious. The tension in her voice was palpable. They were so close. "Stand back," Boone said. He went to his wagon and returned with a heavy mallet and a cold chisel from his tool roll. It felt wrong, like breaking into a tomb, but they had no choice. He positioned the chisel's sharp edge against the hasp of the lock. He took a steadying breath and brought the mallet down. The first blow rang out, a sharp metallic clang that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet valley. The old iron held. He struck it again, harder, and again. On the 4th blow, the rusted metal shrieked and snapped. The lock fell to the floor with a dull thud. For a moment, no one moved. They stared at the chest, at the violated lock, as if expecting some ghost to rise and admonish them. Then, with a shared, unspoken breath, Boone reached forward and lifted the lid. The air that rose from the chest was stale and musty, the smell of time and secrets. The contents were packed tightly. On top lay a bundle of papers tied with a faded ribbon. Boone lifted them out with a reverence that surprised him. These were official documents, heavy vellum covered in the ornate script of law clerks and land agents. He untied the ribbon and spread them on the floor. Tessa and Daisy knelt beside him, their heads close together as they deciphered the legal language. The first document was a deed, but not just for the cabin and 5 acres. It was a deed for 25 acres, encompassing the entire north end of the valley. Another paper was a bill of sale for a livery stable in the nearby town of Redemption. A third was a title for a warehouse by the new railroad spur. There were even 2 mining claims for silver in the surrounding mesas. My God, Boone breathed. Elias Ward wasn't just a homesteader. He was a man of property, a man of substance. The $40 cabin wasn't his last stand. It was the humble center of a growing enterprise. Quentin Slade hadn't just stolen a house. He had stolen a man's entire fortune, piece by piece. Beneath the legal papers was a single, leather-bound book, a journal. It was worn, its cover softened with use. Boone opened it. The pages were filled with a neat, precise hand. The ink faded from black to a rusty brown. "What is it?" Daisy asked. "It's his diary," Boone said, "Elias Ward's." They didn't read it aloud. They huddled together, Tessa holding the lantern closer as Boone turned the pages. All 3 of them reading in silence, absorbing the words of the man whose life they had stumbled into. The early entries were full of hope. Ward wrote of the land, of the good water in the creek, of his plans to build a small ranch. He wrote of his work in the town of Redemption, of the livery stable he was building from the ground up, of the promise of the coming railroad. He was a builder, a man who saw a future in the dust and rock. Then, about a year ago, a new name appeared, Quentin Slade. October 12th. Met a man today named Quentin Slade. He has established a new office in town, a man of finance and investment. He calls himself very well dressed and smooth of tongue. He has taken a great interest in my affairs, speaks of partnership and progress for the whole territory. I confess I am wary. His eyes are like a banker's. They see only numbers, not the sweat that goes into the work. The entries continued. Slade's name appeared more and more frequently. The tone of the diary began to shift, the early optimism slowly eroding, replaced by a thread of anxiety. November 5th. Slade made me an offer today. He wishes to consolidate our interests. He would manage the finances of the stable and warehouse, offering me protection from the less savory elements that the railroad brings. It sounded less like an offer and more like a demand. I politely refused. I told him I'm a man who prefers to manage his own business. He did not seem pleased. He said a man alone in these parts is a man at risk. The veiled threats soon gave way to open intimidation. A new name appeared in the diary. Jed. December 1st. A man came to the livery today, a brute with a terrible scar on his face who called himself Jed. He said, "Mr." Slade had sent him to make sure my horses were secure. He and his men loitered all day, unnerving my customers. It was a clear message. This is the protection Slade was offering. Protection from himself. The pages chronicled a slow, methodical campaign of terror. A fire in a hay shed that couldn't be proven as arson. Fences cut in the night. Threats made to Ward's stable hands until they quit, one by one. Elias Ward was being isolated, his business choked, his spirit worn down. January 22nd. They came to the house last night, Jed and 2 others. They did not try to get in. They just stood outside, in the dark. I could see the glow of their cigarettes. They stayed for hours. I am a prisoner in my own home. Slade is trying to break me. He wants my properties for pennies on the dollar. He wants me to run. But where would I go? This is all I have built. This is my life. The final entries were short, the handwriting less steady, more frantic. He knew he was losing. He knew he was a dead man walking. February 14th. I have hidden my papers and this journal. It is all the proof I have. Slade now owns the town marshal and has the ear of the circuit judge. The law will not help me. I am alone. He gave me a final offer today. Sign everything over to him for a pittance, or he will take it. He said it with a smile. It was the smile of a devil. And then, the last entry, just a few lines, written in a rushed, desperate scrawl, dated the very next day, February 15th. Jed is outside. They are coming. I do not expect to see the morning. If I disappear, if I am gone from this place, know that Quentin Slade is the culprit. He is a thief and a murderer. The diary ended there. The rest of the pages were blank. The three of them sat in stunned silence, the lantern light flickering on their faces. The dusty cabin no longer felt like a simple shelter. It felt like a crime scene. The journal in Boone's hands was no longer just a book. It was a dead man's testimony. They had found the truth they were looking for, and it was colder and more dangerous than they had ever imagined. They now held the proof that could destroy Quentin Slade, and a motive for him to silence them for good. The 3-day deadline was no longer just a threat of extortion. It was a death sentence. The discovery of the journal changed the air in the cabin. It was no longer a simple shelter, but a tomb holding a dead man's final words. The heavy leather book and the bundle of deeds lay on the small table like a judgment, a terrible weight that pressed down on all three of them. The flickering lantern light cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, making the small space feel both like a sanctuary and a cage. They had found the truth, but the truth was a venomous snake, and they were now holding it by the tail. "He knows," Tessa said, her voice a strained whisper. She was staring at the journal as if it might speak again. "Slade, he must know this is here, or at least, he suspects." Boone nodded, his face grim in the lamplight. A man like Ward wouldn't just run. Slade would have figured he'd leave something behind. A record, insurance. That was why Jed and his men hadn't just been collecting money. Their visit was a test, a way to probe for weakness, to see what was left behind. "What do we do?" Daisy asked, her voice trembling. The initial shock had passed, replaced by a cold, pervasive fear. She kept glancing at the door, as if expecting Jed's scarred face to reappear at any moment. "We put it back," Boone said decisively. "Exactly as we found it. We can't let them know we've found it. Our only advantage is that they don't know what we know." Carefully, reverently, they bundled the papers and the journal together, tied the ribbon just as it had been, and placed them back inside the iron-banded chest. Boone lowered the chest into its hiding place and settled the floorboard back over it, scattering a thin layer of dust along the seams to obscure their work. To any casual observer, the floor was once again undisturbed, but they knew. They could feel the presence of the chest beneath their feet, a pulsing, dangerous secret. There was no thought of sleep. They sat in the oppressive silence, each lost in their own fears. Boone's mind raced. The journal was their only weapon, but how could they possibly use it as Ward himself had written? Slade owned the town marshal. Walking into redemption with these papers would be suicide. Tessa was cleaning a small, single-shot rifle with a fierce, focused energy, her movements sharp and angry. Daisy was huddled in a blanket, trying to make herself as small as possible. The night deepened, becoming an impenetrable, ink-black wall around the small cabin. The only sounds were the chirp of crickets and the whisper of the wind through the cottonwood sounds that had seemed peaceful just a day before, but now sounded like stealthy footsteps and hushed conspiracies. It was well past midnight when the sound came, a single, sharp crack of a twig breaking just outside the window. Instantly, all three of them froze. Boone put a finger to his lips, his eyes wide in the gloom. Tessa silently lifted the rifle. They held their breath, listening. For a long moment, there was nothing. Maybe it was just an animal, a deer or a coyote. Then they heard it again. Closer this time, the soft thud of a boot heel on hard earth. They weren't waiting for the 3-day deadline. They were here now. Boone silently moved to the door, pressing his ear against the rough wood. He could hear low, guttural voices. He couldn't make out the words, but he recognized the tone. It was the sound of predators closing in. He motioned for Tessa and Daisy to move to the far side of the room, away from the door and the single, unshuttered window. There was no knock. There was no warning. Just a sudden, violent crash as a heavy boot slammed into the door. The wooden bar holding it shut splintered with a sound like breaking bones. The door flew open, banging against the interior wall. Two figures filled the doorway, silhouetted against the faint starlight. It wasn't Jed. It was his two companions, the brutish, empty-eyed men, Cole and Silas. They paused for a second, letting their eyes adjust to the dim lantern light, their expressions flat and menacing. Cole held a crowbar in one hand. "Mister," Slade changed his mind. Silas grunted, his voice as dull as his eyes. "He wants to collect tonight." He stepped into the room, his gaze sweeping over the sparse interior. Tessa raised the rifle, the barrel trembling slightly, but her aim steady. "Get out!" she commanded, her voice low and dangerous. Cole let out a lazy, contemptuous laugh. "Put that toy down, girlie, before you hurt yourself." He took another step inside, ignoring the rifle pointed at his chest. He knew, and she knew, that she could probably get one of them, but only one, and the consequences would be dire. "We ain't here for you," Cole said, his eyes scanning the floor. "Not tonight. Anyway, we're here for a box, an old chest, mister. Slade has reason to believe the old man left something behind. He wants it, now." So this was it. Slade's paranoia had gotten the better of him. He couldn't wait. He needed to know what secrets Ward had left buried. "There is no box," Tessa lied, her voice tight. Silas moved to the hearth, kicking over the stack of pots with a loud crash. Cole started on the other side of the room, overturning the small table. They weren't searching. They were destroying, tearing apart the small semblance of a home the sisters had built. Boone stood his ground near the back wall, his hands clenched into useless fists. He was calculating the odds, and they were impossibly bad. Cole's boot kicked one of the bedrolls aside, the one that had been covering the loose floorboard. He stared down at the floor, his dull eyes showing a flicker of interest. He saw the faint outline, the subtle difference in the dust. "Well, well," he sneered. "What do we have here?" He wedged the tip of the crowbar into the seam and pried. The board came up easily. He grunted with satisfaction as he saw the dark shape of the chest below. It was over. They had lost. In a moment, the journal and all their hope would be in Slade's hands. They would be left with nothing, defenseless against whatever Jed and his men decided to do to them when they returned. A terrible, suffocating despair filled the room. Tessa's rifle sagged. Boone felt the fight drain out of him. But then, a small voice cut through the tension, thin but clear. It was Daisy. She had pushed herself into the corner, half hidden by shadow. She was trembling, her face a pale oval in the darkness. But her voice, when she spoke, held a strange, sharp sliver of ice. "You shouldn't have done that," she said. Cole paused, the chest halfway out of the hole. He looked over at her, a smirk on his face. "And why's that, little bird?" "Because the Millers will have heard it," Daisy said. Silas, who had been about to help lift the chest, stopped and looked at her. "The who?" "The Millers," Daisy repeated, her voice gaining a fraction more strength. "Our neighbors, just over that ridge." She gestured vaguely with her head. "That sound, the door breaking, it carries in this valley at night. Mr. Miller, he's a very light sleeper, fought in the war. He sleeps with a rifle right by his bed." Boone and Tessa stared at her in stunned silence. There were no Millers. There were no neighbors for miles. It was a bluff, a wild, desperate fabrication born of pure terror. Cole chuckled, but it was a little less confident this time. He glanced toward the open doorway, into the black, silent night. "Nice try, girl. There ain't no one out here but us." "He has dogs, too," Daisy added, her voice never wavering. "Two big ones. They bark at anything that moves. I'm surprised you didn't hear them when you rode up. And Mrs., Miller. She'll be on a horse to fetch the marshal in redemption by now. She won't find the one Mr. Slade owns, though she'll find the real marshal. The one who comes through on the circuit. The one who doesn't like Mr. Slade very much. Every detail was a lie, but she said it with such simple, unadorned conviction that a seed of doubt was planted. Cole and Silas were thugs, not thinkers. They were paid to follow orders, not to analyze the tactical situation of a remote valley. Their orders were to get a box. Their orders did not include getting into a gunfight with some unknown, war-hardened farmer with big dogs and a wife who knew which marshal to fetch. Silas shifted his weight nervously. "Cole," he began, his voice low. "Shut up," Cole snapped, but his eyes were still on the dark doorway. He looked at the chest, then at the 3 defiant faces in the cabin. The prize was right there, but the cost had suddenly become uncertain. Slade wouldn't be happy if they came back empty-handed, but he'd be even less happy if they got themselves shot or arrested by a real lawman over a dusty old box. "You're lying," Cole said, trying to regain control, but the accusation had no force behind it. "Am I?" Daisy replied, her voice still quiet. "Listen." And in the silence that followed, the night seemed to come alive with imaginary sounds. The faint baying of a hound, the distant whinny of a horse. The wind itself sounded like a whispered warning. Cole made his decision. He let go of the chest, which fell back into its hole with a heavy thud. The risk wasn't worth the reward. Not tonight. "This ain't over," he snarled, pointing a thick finger at them. It was a threat meant to cover his retreat. "We'll be back, and not just the 2 of us. We'll come back with Jed, and we'll bring enough men to tear this whole valley apart, neighbors or no neighbors." He backed out of the doorway. Silas close behind him. They melted into the darkness, and a few moments later, the sound of their horses galloping away faded into the night. They were gone. The immediate danger had passed. The cabin was a wreck. The door was broken, but they were safe. For now. Boone slowly let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He looked over at Daisy, who was now leaning against the wall, her legs having given out from under her. She was trembling more than ever, the aftermath of her incredible bravery washing over her. Tessa put down the rifle and rushed to her sister, wrapping her in a fierce hug. Boone walked over and looked down at the young woman who had just saved them with nothing but a story. She had found a different kind of weapon, a different kind of courage. "The Millers?" he asked softly, a hint of awe in his voice. Daisy looked up at him, a tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. A tiny, shaky smile touched her lips. "I figured," she whispered, "that a lie was all we had left." He knew she was right, but he also knew that their lie had bought them only a little time. Cole's final threat was not a bluff. They would be back, and they would be ready for a fight. The clock was still ticking. Only now, it was ticking faster. The aftermath of the attack was a cold, stark reality in the gray light of pre-dawn. The broken door hung from a single leather hinge like a wounded limb. Inside, the cabin was a shambles, a testament to the violation. But the chest, and the truth it held, was safe. Daisy's quick-witted lie had bought them time, but they all knew it was a currency that would soon be worthless. Boone wedged the splintered door back into its frame, securing it with a length of rope. It was a temporary fix, a flimsy bandage on a mortal wound. Every creak of the wood, every gust of wind that whistled through the cracks, was a reminder that Cole and Silas would be back, and they would not be alone. "They won't be fooled twice," Tessa said, her voice flat. She was sweeping up the shards of a broken clay pot, her movements jerky and efficient. "They'll come back before the 3 days are up. They'll come in daylight, and they'll come ready." "She's right," Boone agreed, testing the rope on the door. "We can't just wait for them. A lie bought us a night. Only the truth will buy us our lives." He turned from the door, his face set in grim lines. For 2 days he had been a man adrift, reacting to the current set by Quentin Slade. Now, he needed a plan. He was a farmer, and a farmer knows that you cannot just wish for rain. You have to dig an irrigation ditch. "We have Ward's journal," he said, his voice gaining a hard-won authority. "We have his deeds. It's proof. It's the kind of proof that even a corrupt marshal would have a hard time ignoring if it was presented to the right man." "And who is this right man?" Tessa asked, her skepticism a sharp edge in her voice. "You heard what Ward wrote. Slade owns the law and redemption." "He owns the town marshal," Boone corrected. "But there's a higher authority. Judge Harlan Briggs. He rides the circuit. He's a hard man, they say. A hanging judge. But he's an honest one. He fears God, not men with money. If we can get this journal into his hands, he'll have to act on it." A flicker of something that might have been hope sparked in Daisy's eyes, but Tessa extinguished it with a hard look. "And where is this Judge Briggs now?" she asked. "He's in redemption," Boone said. "Heard it in the last town I passed through. He's there for the quarterly session. He's our best, maybe our only, chance." Tessa stopped sweeping. She leaned the broom against the wall and crossed her arms, her expression dark. "Let me guess. The only place a man like Judge Briggs would stay in a town like Redemption is the best hotel? The Redemption Grand." Boone's silence was his answer. "And who do you think owns the Redemption Grand?" Tessa pressed, her voice laced with bitter irony. The realization hit Boone like a physical blow. He had met Slade in the polished lobby of that very hotel. He remembered the fine leather chairs, the glint of the brass fixtures. It was the seat of Slade's power, the heart of his web. "Quentin Slade," Boone said, the name tasting like poison. The beautiful, simple plan of walking up to a judge and presenting evidence dissolved into a fool's errand. Briggs was staying in the enemy's fortress. He would be surrounded by Slade's men, his clerks, his spies. Anyone trying to approach him with a story against Slade would be intercepted and dealt with long before they ever reached the judge's door. They would be walking into a trap. "So we are back to nothing," Tessa said, the hope in the room deflating completely. "We cannot fight them here, and we cannot fight them in town." They stood in the wrecked cabin, the weight of their predicament pressing in on them. They were cornered. Boone looked at Tessa's defiant posture and Daisy's returning fear. He thought of Jed's leering face and his vile threats. No, he would not let this be the end of it. There had to be another way. Not straight through the front door, but around the back. "I know a man," he said slowly. The words reluctant. It was an admission of failure, an acknowledgement that he could not do this alone. "His name is Fletcher Knox. He used to work for me, on the farm." The memory was a ghost from another life, a life where Boone had been a man of substance, a man who hired others. Fletcher had been young then, wiry and tough, the best horseman Boone had ever seen. When the farm went under, Boone had paid him his last wages and sent him on his way. He'd heard Fletcher had set up a trading post and livery just outside Redemption, on the North Road. He dealt in horses and information, and it was said he wasn't too particular about who he dealt with, as long as their coin was good. Fletcher Knox knew the underbelly of the territory. He knew how to move without being seen. "Can you trust him?" Tessa asked, her eyes searching his. "I don't know," Boone admitted honestly. "It's been 5 years. Men change, but he was a good man then, and he owes me nothing, which, in a way, makes him more trustworthy. I'm not calling in a debt. I'll be asking for a favor, a dangerous one." "What can he do?" Daisy asked. "He knows Redemption better than Slade does. I'd wager he knows the back ways. The quiet times. He has horses, good ones, fast ones. He might have weapons. More than that, he's smart. He knows how to think around corners. We need a new plan. Fletcher can help us make one." It was their only option, a desperate long shot, but better than waiting for the inevitable. "We can't all go," Tessa said immediately. "They might come back. Someone has to stay here. With the journal." She was right, and it was clear who had to go. Boone was the only one who knew Fletcher. "I'll go," he said. "I'll leave tonight. As soon as it's dark, I'll take the creek bed as far as I can. It'll be slower, but my mare and I will leave less of a trail." The rest of the day was spent in tense preparation, while Tessa and Daisy worked to make the cabin defensible, barring the window and piling what little furniture they had against the broken door. Boone prepared for his journey. He packed a small canvas bag with the last of his hardtack and a canteen of water. He checked the shoes on his old mare, Bess, praying they would hold. As the sun began to set, casting long, bloody streaks across the sky, Tessa approached him. She was holding the single-shot rifle. "Take this," she said, holding it out to him. Boone shook his head. "You need it more than I do. I'm not riding into a fight. I'm riding to avoid one." "And if you find one anyway," she countered, "take it. Daisy and we have other ways. We know this valley. We can hide where they will never find us if we have to. You will be alone, on an open road." He saw the iron logic in her eyes and relented. Taking the rifle, it felt foreign and heavy in his farmer's hands. He waited until the last sliver of light had vanished behind the mesas, and a blanket of stars was cast across the sky. The darkness was their ally now. He saddled Bess, his movements quiet and practiced. Tessa and Daisy stood in the shadow of the cabin, two silent figures watching him. "Fletcher Knox's livery," Boone said, "committing it to their memory as much as his own, on the north road out of town. If I'm not back by the day after tomorrow, you take the journal and you run. Head east. Don't stop." Tessa nodded once, a sharp, quick gesture. "Be careful. Boone Carter." It was the first time she had used his full name. It wasn't a plea or a prayer. It was a command from an equal, a partner in a desperate venture. He mounted Bess and urged her not toward the open plains, but down into the shallow, gravelly creek bed. The water muffled the sound of her hooves. He rode hunched low over her neck, a lone figure moving through the darkness on a mission to find a ghost from his past, hoping he could provide them with a future, the fate of 3 people, and the truth of a murdered man. Now rested on the memory of an old friendship and the courage of a man who had already lost everything once before. The ride was a journey through a landscape of ghosts. Every shadow cast by a saguaro cactus was a man with a rifle. Every skittering rock was the sound of a stalking horse. Boone Carter was not a man of the wilderness. He was a man of the soil, of straight furrows and predictable seasons. Out here, in the shifting, deceptive dark, he felt like a child in a monster's closet. He kept the rifle Tessa had given him across his lap, its cold weight a poor substitute for the confidence he lacked. His old mare, Bess, was the only steady thing in the moving darkness, her plodding hooves a familiar, rhythmic comfort. He followed the creek bed for as long as he could, the shallow water splashing softly, obscuring his trail. But eventually, the creek veered south, and he was forced onto the open, moon-drenched plains. He felt naked and exposed, a single, slow-moving target against a silvered canvas. He urged Bess on, the little mare giving him all she had left, her breath coming in tired, misty plumes in the cool night air. It was nearly 3 in the morning when he saw it, a faint, solitary lantern glow on the horizon. Fletcher Knox's place. It wasn't much, just a long, low-slung building that served as a stable, a small, attached cabin that was Fletcher's home, and a collection of corrals. It was an island of rough-hewn civilization in a sea of emptiness. As he drew closer, a dog started barking, a deep, resonant sound that promised trouble for strangers. A light appeared in the cabin window, and a moment later, the door opened, spilling yellow light into the yard. A figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, a shotgun held loosely in the crook of his arm. "That's far enough," a voice called out, sharp and wary. "State your name and your business." "Fletcher, it's me, Boone Carter." There was a long pause. The man in the doorway stepped out from the shadow, squinting into the darkness. He was leaner than Boone remembered, all wire and leather, with a cautious, assessing gaze that missed nothing. The 5 years since Boone had last seen him had sharpened his edges. Boone Fletcher said, his voice a mixture of disbelief and concern. He lowered the shotgun. Good God. Man, what in tarnation are you doing out here in the middle of the night? I almost took you for a rustler. Boone swung his leg over Bess's back. His body so stiff he nearly stumbled. He felt 100 years old. I need your help. Fletcher, I'm in a bad way. Fletcher Knox had a face that kept its secrets. He didn't ask questions out in the open. He simply nodded, took Bess's reins, and led her toward the stable. Put her in the end stall. He said, there's fresh water. Then come inside. You look like you've seen a ghost. Inside the cabin, a pot of coffee was already on the stove, its bitter, earthy smell filling the small, cluttered room, while Boone drank the scalding liquid, letting it chase the chill from his bones. He told his story. He left nothing out the $40 deed. The 2 Apache sisters, Quentin Slade, Jed's threats, Daisy's terror, and the discovery of Elias Ward's journal. Fletcher listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. He sat across the small table, slowly rolling a cigarette, his eyes never leaving Boone's face. When Boone was finished, the silence in the room was as heavy as a tombstone. Quentin Slade, Fletcher said, the name coming out with the smoke from his cigarette. You didn't just step in a snake hole. Boone, you bought the whole damn nest. You know him. Everyone on the fringe knows him, Fletcher said, his voice a low growl. He's a spider, buys up debt, forges documents, threatens, bribes. He's got his hooks in half the businesses in redemption. And he's got Marshall Thompson in his pocket. Ward was right about that. Thompson is nothing but Slade's errand boy with a badge. Fletcher took a long drag from his cigarette. This journal, it could ruin him, which means he'd kill a dozen men to get it back and bury it. That's why I came to you, Boone said. The plan is to get it to Judge Briggs, but he's at the Grand Slade's Hotel. We need a different way, a smarter way. Fletcher stood up and began to pace the small room, his boots making soft, rhythmic thuds on the floorboards. Getting to Briggs in that hotel is impossible. Slade's men are the bellhops, the clerks, the bartenders. They'd spot you coming a mile away. You'd be dead in a back alley before you ever saw the second floor. Just then, a sound came from outside, the soft nicker of a horse, followed by a low curse. Fletcher froze, his hand instantly going to the pistol holstered on his hip. He moved to the window, peering through a crack in the curtains. Stay put, he whispered to Boone. Don't make a sound. He opened the door a crack and slipped outside. Boone could hear muffled voices. One of them Fletcher's, calm and professional. The other unfamiliar, tense and hurried. A few minutes later, Fletcher returned, closing the door quietly behind him. He was not alone. The man who followed him in was young, no more than 20, with a nervous energy that made him seem like a cornered animal. His face was pale in the lantern light, his eyes wide with fear. He looked vaguely familiar, and then Boone placed him. He was one of the men he'd seen in town, one of the aimless, hard-faced young men who always seemed to be loitering near Slade's office. He was one of them. Boone instinctively moved his hand toward the rifle resting against the wall. Easy. Boone, Fletcher said, holding up a hand. This is Curtis. He's one of Slade's employees. Or he was. His horse threw a shoe on the North Road. He came here to get it fixed. What does he want? Boone asked, his voice hard. The young man, Curtis, wouldn't meet his gaze. He stared at the floor, twisting the brim of his hat in his hands. Heard you talking, Curtis mumbled. Through the wall, while Fletcher was getting his tools. Heard you say the names. Slade, Elias Ward. He finally looked up, and Boone saw not malice in his eyes, but a desperate, hunted look. You're the man from the cabin. Slade's been talking about you. He knows you rode out tonight. He knows you came for help. A cold dread washed over Boone. They were being watched. Slade's net was wider than he'd ever imagined. How, Boone asked. He has trackers, 2 of them. Apaches. Ironically enough, hired them off a reservation down south. They can follow a ghost across bare rock, Curtis said, his words tumbling out in a rush. They followed you. They know you're here. They're watching this place right now, waiting to see what you do next. Slade gave orders. No one is to get back to that cabin. The trap had sprung. They were pinned down. Why are you telling us this? Fletcher asked, his voice sharp, cutting through the fear. Why betray the man who pays your wages? Curtis swallowed hard. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a folded, yellowed piece of paper. It was a deed. He held it out, his hand shaking. That's the deed to my mother's boarding house, he said, his voice thick with shame. She was a widow, worked her fingers to the bone to pay it off. When she passed, Slade came to me. He said there were back taxes, legal fees. He confused me with papers and numbers. I was young and stupid. He got me to sign it over to him for a fraction of what it was worth. He said he'd give me a job, a way to make a man of myself. He threw the deed on the table. It landed next to the coffee cups, a testament to another life ruined by Slade's greed. I took the job, Curtis continued, his voice cracking. I needed the money. I told myself it was just business. But then I saw what he did to others. To Ward, and now, to those women. That girl, Daisy. I heard Jed talking about her. It made me sick. It was the same look Slade had in his eyes when he was talking about my mother's property. It was an act of rebellion born from a guilty conscience. Curtis was trying to undo a wrong by preventing another. He was trying to save his own soul. He's a monster, Curtis whispered, and I've been feeding him. I can't do it anymore. Fletcher picked up the deed, his expression grim. It was another piece of the puzzle, another nail for Slade's coffin, if they could ever reach the carpenter. The trackers out there change things, Fletcher said, his mind already working, discarding the old plan and forging a new one. We can't ride back, we can't ride anywhere, but Slade is focused on this cabin. He's focused on you, Boone. He thinks the journal is still back there, and you're the only one who can lead him to it. He's waiting for you to make a move. So what do we do? Boone asked. Fletcher looked at Curtis. The stagecoach. When does the eastbound stage leave Redemption? Dawn. Curtis answered immediately. 6 o'clock from the main depot. And Judge Briggs is leaving on it. Curtis nodded. Heard Slade telling Marshal Thompson to give the judge a fine send-off. Make sure he leaves town with a good impression. Fletcher's eyes lit up with a gambler's fire. That's it. That's our chance. Slade will have all his attention focused out here, on the roads leading back to your valley. He won't be looking for trouble in his own backyard. Not at dawn. Not at a public stagecoach depot. The new plan was audacious and incredibly dangerous. You want us to ride into Redemption? Boone asked. Incredulous. Not us. You, Fletcher said, pointing at Boone. Curtis will go back and tell the trackers he got his horse shot and he's heading back to town. He'll lead them on a wild goose chase. That will buy you a few hours. I'll give you my fastest horse. You won't ride back to the valley. You'll circle wide, come into Redemption from the south, like you're just another traveler. You'll go straight to the stagecoach depot. Tessa and Daisy have to meet you there. How? Boone asked. They're trapped. They have the journal. They'll have to make a run for it on foot, just before dawn. It's their only chance. Fletcher said, It's a long shot. Boone. The longest there is, but it's the only shot you've got. He turned to Curtis. You'll do it. You'll lead them away. Curtis straightened up, a flicker of resolve hardening his young face. He had made his choice. He picked up his mother's deed from the table and tucked it back into his coat. I'll do it, he said, for her. The new plan was set, a desperate, frantic race against time, converging on a dusty stagecoach depot at dawn. It was a plan built on the courage of a broken farmer, the loyalty of an old friend, and the redemption of a lost young man. Boone looked out the window into the deep, unforgiving night. The ride here had been hard. The ride ahead would be impossible. But for the first time, he wasn't just running from something. He was riding toward a final confrontation. The world before dawn is a cold, brittle thing. It was into this gray, unforgiving light that Boone Carter rode, not on his tired old mare, but on a lean, powerful gelding that Fletcher had pushed on him, a horse that ate up the miles with a long, ground-covering stride. He rode with the ghost of Elias Ward in his saddlebag and the fate of 2 women in his heart. He didn't ride like a hero. He rode like a farmer with one last seed to plant, praying for a harvest. He skirted redemption, coming in from the south as Fletcher had instructed. A lone, dusty rider, indistinguishable from any other drifter looking for a day's work. The town was still mostly asleep, its windows dark and empty eyes. But the stagecoach depot was an island of light and activity. A mud-splattered Concord stage stood waiting, its team of 6 horses already harnessed, stamping their feet and snorting plumes of steam into the chilly air. Lanterns hung from the depot eaves, casting long, distorted shadows. Boone dismounted, his legs stiff, his body a single, comprehensive ache. He scanned the handful of people milling about a few tired-looking passengers, a hostler loading baggage, the station operator, a stout, no-nonsense woman with her hair in a tight bun. He saw no sign of Tessa or Daisy. A cold knot of fear tightened in his stomach. Had they made it, or had Slade's men found them in the dark? Then he saw them. They were huddled in the deep shadow of a water trough, looking small and lost. They had made it, but the journey had taken its toll. Tessa's dress was torn at the hem, her face scratched from pushing through brush. Daisy leaned against her sister, her face pale with exhaustion, but her eyes were alert, scanning the depot with a survivor's vigilance. In Tessa's hands, clutched like a holy relic, was the oilcloth-wrapped bundle containing Ward's journal and deeds. Their reunion was a thing of silent, desperate urgency. No words were needed. Tessa met his eyes, 100 questions and fears passing between them in a single glance. He gave a short, sharp nod, a signal that the first part of the plan had worked. She pushed the bundle into his hands. It felt impossibly heavy. Near the depot office door, standing alone and impatient, was a man who could only be the judge. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a stern, clean-shaven face and a mane of iron-gray hair. He wore a black broadcloth suit, the uniform of unbending authority. He held a cup of coffee and stared at the stagecoach as if he could will it to depart through sheer force of will. This was Harlan Briggs, taking a deep breath that did little to steady his nerves. Boone walked toward him. This was it. The farmer was about to petition the king. Judge Briggs Boone's voice came out as a rough croak. The judge turned, his eyes the color of a winter sky. They were cold, assessing, and unimpressed. He looked Boone up and down, taking in the dust, the worn clothes, the exhaustion etched into his face. I'm about to depart. If you have a grievance, it will have to wait for the next session." "It can't wait, sir," Boone said, his voice gaining a measure of strength. He held up the bundle. "This is evidence. Evidence of property theft on a grand scale. Evidence of extortion. Evidence of murder." The last word hung in the cold air. It was a word that got a man's attention. Briggs's eyes narrowed. He looked from Boone's earnest, desperate face to the 2 Apache women who had moved out of the shadows to stand a few feet behind him. "Those are serious charges, Mr. "Carter, sir, Boone Carter." Before the judge could reply, a new voice, smooth and confident as polished silver, cut in, "Judge Briggs, I trust my hotel treated you well. I came to see you off personally." Quentin Slade moved out of the depot office, a picture of tailored prosperity. He was smiling, but his eyes, when they fell on Boone and the sisters, were as cold and dead as river stones. Behind him, looking smug and self-important, was Marshal Thompson, his badge catching the lantern light. The trap had closed around them. "Mr. Slade," the judge said, his tone neutral. "It seems this man has some manner of complaint against you." Slade's smile widened, a predatory, dismissive gesture. "Ah, Yes, Mr. Carter, a drifter with a faulty deed to a property I sold him. And these two, he said, waving a dismissive hand at Tessa and Daisy, are squatters who have been taking advantage of an empty cabin. It's a simple, if tedious, property dispute. Marshal Thompson and I were just on our way to sort it out. There's no need to trouble you with such local trifles. Marshal Thompson stepped forward, putting his hand on his holstered pistol. It wasn't a direct threat, but an unmistakable display of power. That's right. Judge, this is a town matter. I'll be taking them into custody for trespassing and disturbing the peace. He was going to arrest them. He was going to take the journal, and they would disappear into a jail cell, silenced for good. Boone's heart hammered against his ribs. It was all falling apart. I think not, Marshal, Judge Briggs said, his voice cutting like a whip. He hadn't taken his eyes off Boone. This man mentioned murder. I will hear what he has to say. He held out his hand to Boone. Give it to me, son. With shaking hands, Boone gave the bundle to the judge. Briggs placed his coffee cup on a nearby barrel and untied the ribbon. He unfolded the deeds first, his eyebrows rising slightly as he saw the scope of Elias Ward's holdings. Then he opened the journal. He didn't read it all. He flipped through the pages, his practiced eye catching dates and names. He stopped at the last, frantic entry. He read it once, then again. A deep, profound stillness settled over him. He lifted his head, and the look he gave Quentin Slade was no longer neutral. It was the look of a man who had just seen the face of pure evil. If I disappear, know that Quentin Slade is the culprit. The judge read aloud, his voice booming in the quiet morning. He is a thief and a murderer. Slade's smile finally vanished, replaced by a mask of cold fury. The ravings of a madman. Ward was a drunk who fled his debts. A drunk who kept meticulous records, Briggs countered, holding up the journal. This is his hand. I've seen it on a dozen court filings. This is his testimony. It's his word against mine, Slade snapped, his composure beginning to crack. And I am a respected businessman. He is a ghost. Who will you believe? That's enough, Marshal Thompson barked, taking a step toward Boone. You're under arrest. Hold it, all of you. The shout came from the edge of the depot yard. All heads turned. Stumbling out of the half-light, his horse lathered and breathing hard, was Curtis. He was panicked and exhausted, but he was there, in his hands. He clutched a small, tin document box. He's lying, Curtis yelled, pointing a trembling finger at Slade. Everything he says is a lie. Slade's face went white with rage. Curtis, you foolish boy! Hold your tongue! But Curtis wasn't listening. He ran forward, shoving the tin box into Judge Briggs's hands. Ward knew Slade would come for his journal. He made copies, true copies of all the deeds, before Slade's forger could get to them. He gave the box to my mother to hide, just before he disappeared. He told her it was insurance. I found it last night, after I left Fletcher's place. Judge Briggs opened the box. Inside, nestled in yellowed cotton, were the papers, deeds, mining claims, bills of sale, each one a clean, legal nail in Slade's coffin. It was irrefutable. Slade was cornered. He looked from the box to the judge's stone-cold face. His eyes darted around the depot, searching for an escape that didn't exist. His power, built on whispers and threats and the fear of men like Curtis, was evaporating in the morning light. It was then that the station operator, the stout woman Boone had noticed earlier, stepped forward. She wiped her hands on her apron, her face a mixture of fear and resolve. "The judge is right," she said, her voice clear and strong, ringing with the conviction of a long-suppressed truth. "My name is Martha Granger. I've run this depot for 20 years. I knew Elias Ward. He was a good, honest man. He wasn't a drunk. And I know Mr. Slade. I've seen how he operates, squeezing good people, taking what isn't his. We all have. We were just too afraid to speak up." A murmur of agreement went through the small crowd of onlookers. A few men nodded. The fear that had held redemption in its grip for so long was finally breaking. Martha Granger's courage was infectious. Judge Harlan Briggs had seen and heard enough. He closed the journal and the tin box with a final, decisive snap. He looked at the town marshal, a man sworn to uphold the law, and saw only a criminal in a tin badge. "Marshal Thompson," the judge declared, his voice echoing with the full weight of the law. "You are a disgrace to your office. I am placing you under arrest for conspiracy to defraud and obstruction of justice." Thompson stared, his mouth agape, his bluster completely gone. Then Briggs turned his icy gaze on Quentin Slade. Slade, for his part, drew himself up, a final, pathetic attempt to cling to his shattered dignity. The judge pointed a finger at him. "And you, Mr. Slade, you are under arrest for the theft of the properties of Elias Ward, and on suspicion of his murder." He looked past them, to a stern-looking man in a dusty duster who had been quietly watching from the stagecoach door the federal marshal assigned to protect the judge. "Deputy, disarm these men and take them into custody. They will be held for trial." For a moment, there was a stunned silence. Then, as the federal deputy moved forward, his pistol drawn, the spell was broken. Marshal Thompson, panicking, made a foolish, desperate move for his gun. He never cleared the holster. The deputy's pistol came down in a single, brutal arc, striking Thompson on the side of the head. The marshal crumpled to the ground in a heap. Slade didn't move. He simply stood there as the deputy took his pistol, his face a mask of utter, complete defeat. The spider had been caught in his own web. The game was over. As the sun finally crested the eastern mesas, flooding the depot yard with clean, golden light, Boone Carter stood with Tessa and Daisy, watching as the two most powerful men in redemption were led away in shackles. He looked down at his own hands, calloused and empty. He had come to this valley with nothing, and now, in the end, it was nothing but the simple truth that had set them all free. The chaos at the stagecoach depot subsided not into silence, but into a low, buzzing hum of disbelief and dawning relief. The town of Redemption had held its breath for a year under Quentin Slade's thumb, and now, in the clean morning light, it was finally exhaling, as the federal deputy led a shackled, ashen-faced Slade and his disgraced marshal away. The small crowd began to talk, their voices no longer hushed and fearful, but filled with a tentative, rediscovered boldness. Boone, Tessa, and Daisy stood slightly apart from it all, an unlikely island of stillness in the shifting tide. The adrenaline that had fueled their desperate race was gone, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. They had won. They had survived. But the future was a blank, unwritten page, and they had no idea what came next. Judge Harlan Briggs, his duty done for the moment, turned his full attention to them. His stern face had softened, the judge's mask replaced by a look of weary respect. He picked up Ward's journal from the barrel where he'd left it, handling it with a newfound reverence. "Elias Ward was a good man," the judge said, his voice a low rumble. "He deserved better than a lonely death in a forgotten grave. Thanks to you three, his story will be told, his name will be cleared, and his murderer will face justice." He looked from Boone's weathered face to Tessa's proud, tired one, and then to Daisy, who was standing a little straighter now than she had an hour ago. "It took a rare kind of courage to do what you did, the kind this territory desperately needs more of." He gestured toward the depot office, where Martha Granger was already putting on a fresh pot of coffee. "Let's go inside. We have some legal matters to untangle." Inside the cramped office, surrounded by shipping manifests and telegraph keys, the judge laid out the situation. With Slade's arrest, all of his contracts and claims were now under judicial review and likely fraudulent. "First," Briggs declared, his voice leaving no room for argument, "the $40 you paid for this property, Mr. Carter, was the product of a criminal enterprise. The sale is null and void. He reached into his own coat, pulled out a worn leather wallet, and counted out $40 in silver and bills. He pushed the money across the desk to Boone. The court will seize Slade's assets to cover its expenses. Consider this your money returned. Boone stared at the money. It was what he had come for. It was everything he had in the world, but it felt strangely meaningless now. He had fought not for the money, but for the home it represented. And you, ladies, the judge continued, his gaze softening as he looked at Tessa and Daisy. The so-called protection agreement you had with Slade was nothing more than extortion. It has no legal standing. You owe his estate nothing. You are free of him. A shudder went through Daisy, a release of a tension she had carried for 6 long months. Tessa put a steadying hand on her sister's shoulder, but her own eyes were fixed on the judge. Waiting. They were free of Slade, but they were also, once again, homeless. The cabin, and all of Ward's other properties, now belonged to his estate, which the court would administer. What will happen to the house? Tessa asked, her voice quiet. Legally, the judge explained, it must be sold. All of Ward's assets will be liquidated to find any legal heirs he may have had back east. If none are found, the proceeds go to the territory. The hope that had flickered to life at the depot began to die. They had exposed the thief, but they would still lose the home. They would be cast out, just as Slade had intended, only by the clean, impartial hand of the law instead of the grimy fist of a thug. Boone looked at the $40 on the table. He looked at Tessa's and Daisy's crestfallen faces, and he thought of the garden he had started to dig, the feel of the earth under his shovel. He thought of the quiet understanding that had grown between them in that small, besieged cabin. He couldn't go back, not to the lonely, drifting life he had been living. "Let us buy it," Boone said, the word surprising even himself. Judge Briggs raised an eyebrow. "You, Mr. Carter." "No," Boone said, looking at Tessa. Then at Daisy. "Us, the 3 of us, we'll buy it, legally, from the estate." Tessa's head snapped up, her eyes wide with disbelief. Daisy looked from Boone to her sister, a question on her face. With what Tessa asked, her voice barely a whisper. "We have nothing." Boone pushed the $40 to the center of the table. "We have this." Then he looked at the judge. "You said their agreement with Slade was extortion, but they paid him. They paid him $5 for their first month, before they knew what he was." Briggs nodded slowly, beginning to see where Boone was going. "That is true. A payment made under duress." "That money should be returned to them, too," Boone insisted, "from Slade's seized assets." The judge considered this for a moment. A small, rare smile touched the corners of his mouth. He was a man of the law, but he was also a man of justice. An interesting legal argument. "Mr. Carter, I am inclined to agree." He took a $5 gold piece from his wallet and placed it on the table next to Boone's 40. "So, you have a $45 offer for the cabin and 5 acres. There will be filing fees, I imagine," Boone said. "A farmer now haggling with the highest court in the territory to make it all legal and proper. $2. $2 seems fair," Briggs conceded, his smile widening. He added 2 silver dollars to the pile. $47. It lay on the dusty desk, a small heap of money that represented everything that had been taken from them, now reclaimed. It was Boone's last hope, the sisters' coerced payment, and the price of the law itself. "The court accepts your offer of $47 for the property legally described as the Ward homestead," Judge Briggs declared, his voice taking on its official tone. He took a piece of paper and began to write out a bill of sale, his pen scratching authoritatively. When he was done, he signed it with a flourish and pushed it toward them. "It will be registered with the territorial clerk. The property is now legally and jointly yours." Boone, Tessa, and Daisy all stared at the document. At the top, it listed 3 names as the new owners: They were no longer trespassers or squatters or holders of fraudulent deeds. They were landowners. The journey back to the valley was different. They rode together, Boone on Fletcher's borrowed horse, the two sisters sharing Bess. The sun was warm on their backs, and the land no longer seemed hostile. It seemed like a promise. Boone looked at the valley unfolding before them, at the ribbon of green that marked the creek, at the small, gray cabin nestled against the mesas. He realized then that the house itself was just wood and stone. He had been so focused on possessing a place, a shelter, that he hadn't understood what he was truly searching for. A home wasn't a roof over your head. It was the people you chose to share the space under that roof with. It wasn't a place you owned, but a place where you belonged. He had lost a wife and a farm, but he was beginning to see that life wasn't just about what you lost. It was about what you found in the ruins. They arrived to find the door still broken, the inside still a wreck, but it felt different now. It was their wreck, their door to fix. They worked together, without a word needing to be said. Boone, with his farmer's skill, carefully repaired the door, fitting the splintered wood back together, making it stronger than it was before. Tessa and Daisy moved with a quiet, practiced grace, righting the furniture, sweeping the floor, bringing order back from the chaos. That evening, they built a fire in the hearth. It wasn't a fire to ward off the cold or the darkness, but a fire to celebrate. They shared a simple meal of beans and corn cakes that Tessa cooked. It was the best meal Boone had eaten in over a year. They sat in the warm, flickering light, the three of them, the broken white man who had lost his faith, the proud Apache woman who had lost her nation, and the young girl who had found her voice in the darkness. They were a strange and unlikely collection of survivors, brought together by the greed of one man and bound together by their shared refusal to be broken. Looking at Tessa's strong, calm profile and Daisy's tired but peaceful face, Boone Carter knew he was finally home. They were no longer strangers. They were a family, forged in the crucible of the Wild West, a family that had cost $47 and was worth more than all the gold in the territory. Thank you for listening to our story. Let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from to connect and share your thoughts. Please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, like this video, and give it a boost by hitting the hype button to help this story reach more listeners.